Welcome to week one psychology, chapter one and two that you will be reading. This is not the introduction, this is the content video lecture for week one, September 7th through September 13th. All right. Well, not September 13th, September 13th, 14th. Okay. Um, so yeah, here we go. Let's get into the PowerPoint, my friends. Again, every week I'm going to put out a video that generally is about um, 20 to 30 minutes long. I go through material. I'm not going to go through the whole everything exactly. That's what your job is as a student is to read. But I go over some things that I feel are important. I kind of highlight some pieces of psychology. But please, please, please reach out at any time. All right. I can do follow up videos, which I will do, or some recap videos, things that I feel that would be beneficial for you as a student, for you to, really understand a little bit more about psychology. All right. So I'm going to go over some of the contents pieces um, for psychology, and I think it's important. So by the end of this unit, you will be able to discuss, explain, and review. And the reason why I highlighted those key words are those are your essentially think about the action behind your work, right? You will be able to go into your discussion. You will be able to explain things, and you will be able to know that hey, I can review these concepts that are important on not only the history but understanding those kind of those elements of research. Here are your tasks for the week. Again, I'm not going to read through everything. I think it's important for you to go in the learning guide, the learning journal, not learning guide, excuse me, and the learning journal, of course, but the learning guide for you to understand what is expected of you. All right. Feel free to pause this video at any time. All right, I'm going to go over the next slide. Let's see. We go. In week one, chapter one will focus on providing you with the history of psychology and why it is important for you to study the history of psychology, right? And in understanding how the science evolved through research, resulting in empirical evidence, the reason why we have information behind the importance of emotional intelligence. Well, emotional intelligence and understanding emotional intelligence would have never happened without, you know, for example, humanism and Carl Rogers. Those things would have never happened. In understanding the the branches in psychology and how that relates to you in your career fields, right? You're in this course for a reason, whether you want to go beyond um, the university, whether you want to explore and expand your learning of your current career, whether you want to try something new, or maybe you're brand new. This is why psychology is important. Okay. It is an understanding of all things. Remember that. Chapter two will expose you to the different research methods. And as somebody that has been in, you know, uh, you know, a graduate program of psychology, there was a lot of work in terms of researching and in testing the hypotheses, testing, understanding, working through that, reading, citing. Um, but again, it's not like you're going to be doing a lot of that, but it's important to understand where it comes from. Those are key people, really, in these first couple of people that you're going to learn about. Not just those people, but other ideas, other experiments that I think are important for you to work through. Your discussion assignment this week is psychologists and scientists use the words empirical evidence, empirical research, and empiricism in scientific studies. Now, but do we as consumers and users of scientific information, do you understand what these mean? So what you're going to do is you're going to read this, you're going to understand this, work to understand this. I'm not going to say you have to understand it, but you're going to work to understand it, and then you're going to answer the following questions. Again, this discussion assignment is in your learning guide. What parts of our bodies do we rely on upon gathering that empirical evidence? Would you consider your day to day living experience and observations as part of empirical evidence? Why? I am going to emphasize the importance of the minimum and the maximum, but more specifically, the minimum um, in terms of word length in your posts. All right. So make sure you look at that. Your learning journal for the week is the scientific method is a method of inquiry that helps us understand nature around us and within us. Now, when we talk about science as only one way to explain nature and psychology in particular, as one way to explain human behavior, what do you think this means? Can you think of other ways that we have used to explain behavior? Now, I cannot emphasize enough is citing, using the information in what you've been reading to construct your work. That I cannot emphasize enough. And for the first week, I'm going to work to see how you can, I guess, really work through that yourself. Um, but that is going to be so key in understanding, um, what's expected of you each week. All right. So the learning journal should be a minimum of 400 words. I will be a little bit lax and lenient in the first week, maybe the second week, but this is what I expect you. I'm going to highlight that really importance if I can do that. This is so important. Minimum, a minimum of 400 words. Okay, that is so important. All right, all right. Oh, I better put that back on. I don't want that anymore. All right, I'm gonna go like this. So let's dive right into it. I'm gonna actually stop sharing this. I'm gonna go through the actual book this week. Um, there it is, the history of psychology and why we. I guess why is it important to understand, that. And so this is your chapter outline. Again, I'm not going to go through everything. What is psychology, history of psychology, contemporary psychology, careers in psychology. As I mentioned earlier, psychology is everything, right? Everything you can think of, that is what psychology is, right? It's not just um, understanding our motivation behind something or why we develop the values that we have right now in our lives or standards of behavior, but it is the reason why people fall in love with each other, why people fall out of love with each other, why people procrastinate when they have a task in front of them. Why is it such as that, right? So when we think about there's this thing like you might have heard of it as a myth, but people have said at one point that people only use 10% of our brains. Now, is that something that is real? Is that something that is true? So in the world of psychology, right, people would say, look at that and understand to say, well, is that right? Now, psychology is a science, right? It's a social science. So with that understanding of science, there's research that goes behind it, right? There's research in working to understand that. So as we go into chapter 2, you're going to understand how the importance of trying to take something such as that and try to prove it. Is that correct? And how would I find out whether that is right or not? So what is psychology, right? It refers to the scientific study of the mind and behavior. If you're going to think of anything and you're going to define psychology as anything, is I think it's those two things, right? Right. So psychologists use the scientific method to acquire knowledge. Just like I said with the myth of 10% of your brain, or if I say that playing Mozart's music to infants boost their intelligence. I could say that to you, and I could say that in front of a crowd of people, and they'd be like, "Wow, that's great, wonderful. I have to do that." And then people would play their music in front of their infants, and then by the end of 10 years, right? And the child's 10 years old, and they're like, "Well, my student, I don't think my student's intelligent enough. I played Mozart music," right? So what psychology does, right, is tries to understand in the acquiring of knowledge, right? How do we get to that point of understanding what that meant by how does Mozart music? And they're going to study more about the mind and how the mind works to hear that music and what is it doing inside the brain to you know produce a certain type of behavior, right? So there is so many components, right? And you're going to hear in psychology, and I probably talk about it, is the theories, right? A theory is the best understanding. A theory is the best understanding, excuse me, is the best understanding we have of a part of the natural world. The researcher then makes observations, and in psychology, observations are key, right? In my work in the world of school psychology, that's what I do, kind of in my day job. um, is I do a lot of observations, right? I don't just sit down at a piece of paper or anything and do that. I do that sometimes, but what I do is I make general observations, and about the way of how people are acting in certain environments, how they're acting in certain environments with certain people, right? So in psychology, what we can do is we work to understand more about that person, but then those behaviors. But then we can start expanding about how that works in various forums, how we collect data, how many times they're doing certain things. Right now, again, that's more of a broad approach as I'm talking about that. But I think there really is a theme when I'm talking about all of this, that it expands so far beyond that, right? And so as you read the chapter, I think it's important to understand, the various methods, the key terminology. Um, the question is why we study psychology, right? And a lot of people might take this course to say, well, I have to take the general course, I have to get out of the way. But I think I think it's important to work in. Um, it can develop such a awe, right? As such a wonder type of a thinking. All right. And so any type of field you may go into, it is going to, and as we talk about that further in careers and psychology, you're going to understand more about how psychology does match. I mean, you think about economics, you think about somebody that's in the health field. Well, there's health psychology. There is a study of the psychology of why people get ill. There is a reason why stress happens. And when stress happens, why is it making people ill? There is a connection. And so psychology really wants to know more about, not saying they don't want to know about what type of illness, but they want to know why. What's happening with this stress? What's the connection? What's happening in that person's life that is allowing or is making that stress to be relevant? All right. So getting into what we all want to talk about is the history of psychology, right? So you're going to work in understanding keywords, but then that connection to the people in psychology. So uh, Wilhelm once said in it, and he was a German scientist, and he said physiology informs us about those life phenomena that we perceive by our external senses. But in psychology, the person looks upon himself as from within and tries to explain the interrelations of those processes that this internal observation discloses. he actually established the first formal laboratory for research in psychology. So, what that tells us is when a lab was created, well, there was room for being able to understand quite a bit of, well, you could say, these various phenomena, the way we sense things, but not just from the physiology, but from the psychological perspective. When subjects or ideas came in, it was the work of kind of that well, like Wen said, we can understand more of the inner being of the person. Okay, the soul, which is Greek. So the word psychology comes from a Greek word called psyche, meaning the soul. Okay, so think about that when we think about the inner self. So look at that key word right there. He used introspection. He called it internal perception. As I just as I said in that quote about him, he said internal relations, similar, is a process by which um, someone examines their own conscious experiences as objectively as possible, making the human mind like any other aspect of nature that a scientist observed. So he believed in the notion of voluntarism, that people have free will and should know the intentions of psychological experiments if they were participating. So understanding the reasoning. So when I talked about that lab, there was a creation of understanding what that goes into it, what people and why we're studying these people, why we're studying their functions, the mental processes that are happening. Okay. And so they did he did work on experiments. He conducted experiments. Um, but he felt like, and there it is right there, founders of psychology, one of the founders of psychology. And so I think it's important to understand that um, you know, he was somebody that truly wanted, I believe, from what I understand, the best out of those people he associated with. But he wanted people to understand more about themselves in that sense as well. Functionalism is a key, you know, idea. It focuses on mental activities. Um, so it's important that you look through that as well. I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to go through everything. I don't want to keep these videos too long, but I think it's important. Um, this right here is another key piece as well, and I think that is something that you will need to understand, need to work towards as well. Okay, so let me go back actually really quick here. Let's go back to functionalism. My thing is really about functionalism. In psychology, functionalism. Think about this: the word function, right? How things work. But functionalism was really based on a belief that the idea of psychology should not only investigate but dive deep into right the function right functionalism or the purpose of consciousness rather than its structure. The purpose, the purpose. William James once said a key component in functionalism said it is just the free water of consciousness that psychologists resolutely overlook. And I think sometimes that there has been times where functionalism truly did get overlooked in many ways. Um, again, if this stuff doesn't understand to what I'm saying, I'm not trying to ramble. But I do love this subject, and I think it's important to try to um, match kind of what I'm saying to the book as well. And of course, I think it's important for you to, and it is expected for you to read the information in your chapter. Information is there as well. Freud, in the psychoanalytic theory, um, focuses on the role of a person's unconsciousness as well as the early childhood experiences. If you ever go into education, you will read about that quite a bit and him quite a bit. Trust me, a key component. So I want to make sure that this is really, I'm going to star this, that you go more into that. And I'm hoping to have maybe a second video of him. But again, I do want to get through the chapter. Um, the various uh, types of counseling practices, Gestalt psychology, or with the um, Gestalt um, therapy work as well. So it's important that you go through that too for yourself. All right. Um, Pavlov, Watson, Skinner, behaviorism. I love everything about Pavlov. I think Pavlov's theory, if you've ever heard of Pavlov's, um, it is that train, that classical conditioning. If you're going to think of anything with psychology, the first thing when I learned about psychology years ago, I mean, it was right away. It was Pavlov's theory. The dog, the famous dog in the experiment, is something that is right there, and it, let me go back to something really quick with B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner and behaviorism, right? Behaviorism and the idea of psychoanalysis kind of was something of a new concept back in the early 1920s and through the 1930s and 1940s. Those two types of thoughts and theories um, took a while because people looked at that, and we started thinking about opening labs and started thinking about these ideas, and getting more into the behaviors of the individual. Psychology was kind of, well, wait a minute, what are these people doing? What are they trying to do? um People started try to understand, and there was some resistance, but tried to understand more and more and more about the existence of our mental events that were happening, right? And so when we think of behaviorism, right, when something is behaved, right, there's an action behind it, right? And there's beyond just seeing something happening and without making any type of understanding or even a guess towards what's happening there. Psychology works to understand the environmental factors and what's happening in those environments that are molding such behavior, right? So and again, there were times when people would look at, for example, B.F. Skinner. Let's see, where's his right here? That's John Watson. Sorry, B.F. Skinner. Here we go. Um, Picture of B.F. Skinner right here is famous for his research on operant conditioning. Now, there was a misconception one time where he was working towards an experiment where he raised his daughter in a Skinner box, contributing to her becoming severely disturbed later in life. But actually, and again, there's these ways of how people looked at the way these figures in psychology would want to Um, when they did their research, they created these ideas, these theories. They put them into play. They named them. They labeled them, and people would say, "Wow, this is people. They're getting in too much, and getting into understanding the behavior, but in such ways that we look at it now and say, well, that makes sense that they would do these types of experiments to understand more about the terms and the ways in which things were happening and why people were behaving such a way. So in that misconception of B.F. Skinner raising his daughter in a Skinner box, right? Skinner did design a crib, an actual innovative crib called a baby tender for his daughter, right? But it was not a Skinner box, and it was not used for experiments, and apparently was actually kind of comfortable. So, so a lot of people would make these misconceptions about these figures and psychologies, these psychologists, these individuals, and then connect that to how psychology was. So I think it's important when you think about the history of psychology and understanding that it was not something that was always met with open arms, if that makes sense. But then we go from the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. We now look in the 1950s, and in behaviorism, in psychoanalytic theory had now become the most influential schools of thought in psychology. Okay. So so the way in which things were being done took notice. Okay. So people were trying to understand the way they would do experiments with animals, and then work to say, well, if animals are behaving such a way with the elements in which these experiments were carried out, what does that mean in terms of how it's done with people, with students, with yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So it's important for you. Oh, here we go. This is what I was talking about. Um, and let me talk about that in just a minute here. But it's important for you to understand more about kind of that history. And I think that um, I'm picking out key points because we could talk for days and days about the history, truly the history, the key figures. So um, it says right here, the Skinner box is a chamber that isolates the subject from the external environment and has a behavior indicator such as a lever or button. When the animal pushes the button or lever, the box is able to deliver a positive reinforcement of the behavior, such as food or punishment. So this is where I'm talking about where there was that misconception of his daughter being put in something like that, but it wasn't happening. And so when things were being done, when experiments were being done, right? People would say this is how they're doing it. Um, and I feel that there's just like today, right? We can have these misconceptions, but we have to be able to understand more about the reasoning why and do our own research. Okay. So Skinner focused on that positive and negative reinforcement. If you're in education, you understand about the ways of such behaviors, and how that certain behaviors with a negative um, reinforcement or a positive reinforcement, what happens, from either path, right? So, so despite this, at the end of the day, when we think about it, conditioned learning is still used in human behavioral modification. That is something that we know as a school counselor, right? There are things that I go on to, many things every day, that I can say this is how um, why things are happening based on um, how those initial experiments were set up. Okay, so Maslow. Abraham Maslow, Rogers, and the humanism. Humanism has got to be one of my favorites, and Carl Rogers is because of really what it is, and working to understand more about um, the human being. So humanism is a perspective within psychology that emphasizes the potential for good that is innate to all humans. Two of the most well-known proponents of humanistic psychology are Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. And I would say Abraham Maslow in the hierarchy of needs is one of my next favorite. I guess when you think about history of psychology and those key people in psychology, those two right there are my favorite. Carl Rogers once said, "It seems to me that at bottom, each person is asking, 'Who am I really? How can I get in touch with this real self underlying all my surface behavior? How can I become myself?'" And I think that question itself and the way that he worded it and from the perspective of trying to understand people, I go back to the potential for good in all. As a counselor, as somebody that I work with people that have kind of tried to go negative on themselves and say, "I am not good, I am not worthy," or they can't see the good in themselves. That to me is why this idea, this theory, is such an important piece. And if you look at all of the history of psychology, my friends, it is relevant still today. I mean, we look at Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of human needs in motivating behavior, in the way that in the way that people um, in the way people um, what am I trying to say? I lost my train of thought. In the way, you know, people have needs, and the way that in those needs, if you don't reach one of those items, how can you get to the next one? And what's happening with each one? And I think it's important when you look at it. I mean, if we look at the hierarchy of needs, if you're not meeting those basic needs, right? Those, I mean, this is essential. Any kind of um, teaching you do, or beyond that education, excuse me, you are absolutely going to see more and more of this, and it makes sense because self-actualization, inner fulfillment. I mean, following their passions, follow their skills. At the end of the day, someone's not going to be fully involved in creating that path of trying to find themselves, or finding what they're good at, or wanting to do that, if they're not getting their basic needs. And that's right at the foundation. That's at the beginning, right? You think of a building, you take that foundation off, boom, bam, it's not gonna survive. So it is these pieces of psychology in the history of how uh, they pave this way of this topic, that we can go in a multitude of directions in how it pertains to the work we do. Behavioral. We look at Watson, we look at Pavlov, we look at Skinner, the effect of environments on behavior. We think about how those stimulus responses have happened, right? Freud. We look at Carl Rogers. They're looking at the human experience, the human experience of every day. They know that in humanism, we know that humans are free, rational beings with the potential for personal growth. And so that's why I like it, because that's a big part of what I do is and that's where they argued, where a lot of people would use animals in such experiments in the lab. But Rogers and Maslow felt, I mean, they were like, humans are way different than animals. So we can't look at that as such, and that's apples to oranges, right? I mean, um, Piaget, the cognition, you know, and so I think that's important as you read these pieces. That is going to be important for you to work to understand what is your path in terms of interests, what part of the history of psychology and the creation, the evolution of psychology um, pertains to you, right? All right. Um, we are going to, let's see, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit too as well. I, I encourage you to read the multicultural and the cross-cultural psychology as well. In the especially women in psychology, I feel like that is important. I don't think women in psychology get the um, the credit they deserve. All right, contemporary psychology as well. And again, you'll notice that we talked about that in the intro video, but the APA, American Psychological Association, and how it's done. I also encourage you to listen to these or go to these links for learning if you want. Biopsychology, and evolutionary. It's called the biopsychosocial model. We talk about that later, but this is the biopsychology kind of, and that goes into the biopsychosocial model. Oh, excuse me, of psychology as well. And we'll talk about sensation and perception in another chapter. Cognitive psychology is the area of psychology that focuses on studying cognitions, the memory, the education, or the thoughts, the way we think, not memory, think. Sorry, I did not mean to say memory. I meant to say the way we think, educate ourselves, and its relationship to our experiences and our actions, right? The experiences that we have, that we encounter, but how we act on that as well. All right. That's important to know. Cognitive psychology, um, developmental psychology. If you go and expand yourself into the subtopics, you can learn simply about developmental psychology. All right. And so what that does is the scientific study of development across a lifespan, right? From early childhood, infant to the geriatric stages. Personality psychology, right, is the focus on patterns of thoughts and behaviors that make each individual unique, right? And let's see here. Social psychology, excuse me, is how we interact and relate to others. They do research on a wide variety of topics and include differences in how we explain our own behavior versus how we explain the behavior of others, prejudice, and interaction. Let's go into, yeah, industrial organization psychology, health psychology. That's one of the other classes I teach. Sports and exercise psychology. These are all topics that you can study separately in psychology. Forensic psychology. Um, there's actually, you can go into not only that, sports psychology. There is um, yeah, sports and exercise psychology, health psychology. There's positive psychology, which is newer. Let's see here. Let's see here. Key terms. I would encourage you to look at the key terms as well in this and into what is psychology. All right, we're gonna go into psychological research. I'm not gonna go too much into this. I think it's important. I'm gonna start wrapping up the videos as well. The use of research information and what that means and why it's important in our work. Um, and how we approach behavior. I think that's important when we approach behavior and look at behavior. There are steps, right? And understanding when we look at an investigation, um, carefully planning, right, with those steps, beginning the formulation of testable materials, the hypothesis, excuse me, and the ending with publication or what's happening in the study as well. We think about those keywords as informing of the information. That's key as well. All right. So in this, you'll notice that there is information about noticeable researchers as well. what the process of scientific information is as well. All right. Uh, so an hypothesis is a testable prediction about how the world will behave if our idea is correct. And it is often worded as an if then statement. So if I study all night, if I study all night, I will get a passing grade on the test, right? So the hypothesis, you can't emphasize enough that it is important, is it bridges the gap between the realm of ideas, right? These thoughts that we have, right? And the real world. We make that connection, right? So we know that as things are tested, actually tested, right? Put into that test, theories are modified and redefined to reflect and incorporate the results of these tests. So again, you can confirm it, you can modify it, you can say, well, here's the thing. So when we look at what psychology is and what it tries to do, right? We have these ideas, you hear these things. Can we test it? Can we go into seeing if this is, I mean, is there enough data? Do we get to a point where we take the information right here and do we have enough data, right? It's not just in psychology, but there's a lot of different subjects. There's a lot of different ways in which we can take this information. We can have a theory, we can have this thought, we generate that, right? We collect the data, we have enough information. We look at that, we say, what is the connection? What's happening in there, right? And then we truly have to start summarizing that and then report our findings, right? Whether it be, even in that, we know there's control groups, there's experimental groups. The information in the book will go over kind of that general guideline of what groups are um, of the experiment, the approaches to research, clinical or case studies, naturalistic observations. And to me, that is where you get to see kind of that raw, yeah, data, that raw, well, you could put it into raw data, excuse me, but that information or the experiences you see, observing behavior in its natural environment. This is what's real. This is what's happening. Um, and to me, when I think of naturalistic observations, just in my work, I mean, I could have some behavior concerns and challenges with students, and I could hear about it that they're having X, Y, and Z behavior issues. And then I can put them into a controlled environment, a control room, trying to set up that information, trying to set up the experiment, excuse me. To me, that would most likely not give me the relevant information that I'm trying to work to understand because of its lack of real, right? All right. Let's just keep going just a little bit. I'm almost done. Again, this first video for this is a little bit long, but I'm going to promise you that each video will be a little bit different. Um, let's see here. Analyzing findings, correlation research. If you ever go into your master's in the field of psychology, you will do a lot of research in correlation and in the numbers. Positive correlation and negative correlation. Um, and this is exactly what it means. If you have any questions, again, if you have any questions and you feel you need more information, I will make separate videos. Let's see. Designing the experiments and why we're experimenting. I think I can't emphasize enough that if there's a reason, there's always a reason. A lot of reading. There's got to be a lot of writing behind that, a lot of support. Um, All right. We are going to reliability and validity, key pieces. So when we get into ethics, there are human participants. When you start thinking about that, you're dealing and working with people, that could, harm them, and so there is a series, um, of way to how to access ways of doing something, if that makes sense. Um, Especially if you're getting support from kind of, um, a federal, level, and there's a way that you have to go about doing things, right? There are steps that you have to take, and that in itself, in the world of psychology, there's a lot of discussion. There's going to be, yep, informed consent, information. There is ways of how we want to make sure that we are, being, you know inclusive, that we are being, understanding of individuals and their belief systems. And so there is a lot of, different, you know components in when we are researching, when we are trying to understand, what our objectives are. It's a little bit like Carl Rogers said, like Abraham Maslow. I mean, they're dealing with humans, and they know that animals and humans are two different things. There are ethics in the treatment of animals and such, that have changed over time, but it's so 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 important, that you follow, the necessary steps. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I know this first video might be a little too long. My first ones are usually long, but psychology just has so much information that I get really, excited for, and I want to cover as much without going too over. But if you have any questions and you have any concerns, please reach out to me. Okay. Happy week one. Happy week one.